Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. I'm taping this on May 2nd, 2019, just towards the end of what was a beautiful Thursday, spring day in Manhattan. It's turning into the 20th day of Nisan 5779. As you know, I'm here for the Religious Zionists of America weekend celebrating Israel's Independence Day. But by the time you hear this on Sunday, I will hopefully have completed it successfully. Right now, I don't know, but I'm really looking forward to being in Merrick, Long Island for Shabbat and in Teaneck, New Jersey at Congregation B'nai Yeshurun on Sunday morning. But I took the opportunity of having a little extra time, which I rarely have when I come to the States. And I'm in the Upper West Side with an old friend, with Jay Kranis, and I'm actually going to let him tell you a little bit about when I met him and how we've kept in touch over all these years. He's a little uncomfortable right now, having just undergone surgery. So I've taken advantage of his weakened state and come over for an interview. So first of all, Jay, you should have a very quick recovery and painless recovery from your latest surgery. But tell my listeners where it is that this very unlikely friendship began.
Okay, so Eve and I met in February 2001 in Efrat. It was shortly after the Intifada broke out, which, if I remember correctly, was about October 2000, ostensibly because Sharon visited the Temple Mount. Was that what it was? And I was in Israel with a group from my synagogue, which is a Reform synagogue on the Upper West Side. And we were among the very few groups, A, who were going to Israel at the time, and B, who weren't ensconcing themselves in hotels in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, but rather went out to the hustings. And I remember driving down the tunnel road from Gilo on our way to Efrat. And we were in an unsecured bus, and every once in a while, the bus driver would tell us to hit the ground because we were passing an area where there had been sniper fire. And in fact, as I recall, the week before we arrived, a famous physician whose name I don't remember was shot and killed on that road.
Right, Dr. Shmuel Gillis from he was the head of hematology oncology at Hadassah Ein Kerem, and the Pinah Chama, the warm corner where we feed soldiers, and was actually started in his memory and also in the memory of another man, Tzachi Sasson, who was killed within 2 weeks of him. So that was a really, really difficult time. For those of you who don't know, Efrat was where I live. It's just south of Jerusalem in an area called Gush Etzion. So what Jay's describing is the road that kind of bypasses, goes through under Bethlehem, and I got caught on that road a couple of times also with sniper fire. Those were really, really tough times.
So we come into Efrat, and we're escorted into the community room, and the spokesperson for Efrat, whose name is Eve Harrow, was addressing us. And one of the things that really impressed me was that the mayor of Efrat, who was, I believe, at a memorial service for Dr. Gillis, actually came to address us. And he spoke only Hebrew, and Eve translated for him. And since then, Eve and I, who come from opposite ends of the political spectrum, have been friends. And it's been, for me, a very special friendship. The times I went to Israel after 2001, I always managed to see my friend Eve, and when she comes to Manhattan, she tries to see me. And it's probably bad phraseology, but given our political views, we make strange bedfellows.
That's all obviously theoretical, but no. But you know, this is actually one of the reasons why, for all the times that we've met over the years, I wanted now to talk to you and get it down on tape, because more and more I'm finding, and I know you're finding as well, people are not having this conversation. I mean, I admire you tremendously. People will find out during the course of the podcast why. I just have to tell everybody that Jay said to me, "What exactly is a podcast?" when I sat down here, even though it turns out he listens to them. We're not just our political views. We're human beings. We're people with other opinions about things who can respect each other. we can disagree, we can agree. And every time I come to the States now, especially, I am shocked more and more about it. People are not having the conversation. Everyone is in their own little echo chamber. And so I said, this time I'm going to sit down with Jay and we're going to show the world that this can be done. Two people can care deeply about each other and respect each other and not agree on major things. And that's just fine.
And the irony is that my politics in the States are generally very far to the left, much less so when it comes to Israel. And a lot of that has to do with, my longstanding love for the state of Israel, even though I've never had a desire to live there. It has always been one of my favorite destinations, and every time I land at the airport in Tel Aviv, I never get over it. It's an extraordinary feeling. In the times I've been there, I've made friends with people like Eve. But also, I've had fairly extensive contacts with people on the Palestinian side. And I've never pulled my punches. And what I have found among the Palestinians is that I get a greater degree of respect than the people who are on the left and seem to think that they have to be politically correct every time. And if I may, just as a parenthetical note, I was in Israel in 2009, and I went there with my congregation, which is Congregation Rodef Shalom on the west side of Manhattan. It's a Reform congregation. And our congressional group left. And then my wife and I went from Jerusalem, and we flew on El Al to Cairo, which blew my mind. And after spending some time in Egypt, we came back to Israel, and we arrived on a Friday, and we were invited to a gathering at a school in Beit Jala, the Talitha School, which is an Arab school. And we had actually a hard time getting a taxi to take us there. We had to find an Arab cab driver to do it. And we arrived, and the gathering was of a group called Middle East Peace, which had two co-directors, one of whom was Israeli and the other was Palestinian. And the people in the courtyard were either Israelis or Palestinians, and my wife and I were the only ones who were neither. And we were also the only ones who spoke only English. And the conversations were had in English. And they had a series of tables set up in the courtyard. And at each table there was a designated subject of discussion. And when we arrived at one of the tables, the subject was Zionism and what it means to you as an Israeli and what it means to you as a Palestinian. And we sat down at the table, and this young Palestinian guy got up and started railing about the fact that Zionism was a European movement which was created after World War II with the express intention of bringing the Jewish population of Europe to the Middle East to drive the Arabs out. And I'm waiting for my Israeli colleagues, all of whom were academics, to say something. And nobody did. And I finally stood up and I said, bullshit. I said Zionism was a movement created in the 1800s, that it was, the intent of it was to come to the part of the world which had been the home of the Jewish people for time immemorial, an area where the Jews never left, although were not there in great numbers because they had been driven out, most recently by the Romans in AD 70. And, this guy was the Palestinian guy was kind of nonplussed. And one of the other Palestinians suggested that my friend read the Quran, which makes reference to the Jews at the time of Muhammad. So just to bring this segment to a very quick end, we had to leave early to get our taxi to go back to Jerusalem because it was Friday. And as I'm walking out of the courtyard, I feel somebody slam me in the back. And I turn around, and it was this young Palestinian guy with a big smile on his face and his hand out to shake my hand. And one of the morals that I take from that story is that I've had fairly extended contacts with the Palestinians. I used to work with a group called Alliance for Middle East Peace, made up of 90 NGOs, both Palestinian and Israeli. And I never pulled punches. I always let people know how I felt about Israel. And I think I got a greater deal of respect from the Palestinians rather than the Israelis and or the Americans who thought that they had to be politically correct and not say anything that might arguably offend somebody.
That's something that we have definitely... You need to talk to him? So that's something that we've definitely found, that I've realized big time, my listeners know this also, is that when you have self-respect, then people respect you. And this is a story that I've told over and over again years ago in a debate that I had with someone from Peace Now and a Palestinian Arab in front of a Jewish group. The Arab told me afterwards that basically the Peace guy, the Peace Now person, was his useful idiot, and he didn't respect him because if he could betray his own people, he would definitely betray the Arabs. While me, who he didn't agree with me, but he respected me because I was a proud Jew. That was a very big eye-opening moment, and I see that you had it as well. Even with all the work that you were doing, it's just shocking. It's not shocking to me. It should be shocking to me that the Israelis didn't say anything, that you had to be the one to stand up and talk about the Jewish ties and the Jewish rights.
And the fact is that I've always had these really strong feelings about Israel as a Jew, and the survival of Israel is primary above all. And I have had to confront in the States a lot of contrary views, especially in my congregation. And I think also throughout Europe and the States when it comes to Netanyahu, who I think has been demonized. We had a mayor in the 1960s named John Lindsay, whose first name I thought was fucking. And the reason was that that's how people referred to him because of the snowstorms that didn't get cleaned up properly. And anytime anybody mentioned John Lindsay, it was fucking Lindsay. And when they mention Benjamin Netanyahu, it's the right-wing politician in Israel. Now, from my perspective, it's not aligned with those of many of my colleagues, I think that Netanyahu has been pushed to the right. And I also go back, if I may, to 2001 when I had a meeting with Colette Alvital. And that was a time when Sharon was trying to form a government. And I remember asking her if she had been invited, would she join a Sharon coalition? And she actually spat on the floor. Mm-hmm. And I think that Tzivi Livni fell into that same category. And with the cockamamie political setup in Israel, where you have to get 61 votes in the Knesset in order to have a governing coalition. And since parties, if they're lucky, if they gain 30 seats in a general election, have to piece together a coalition. And if the people on the left are not going to join forces with you, then you're forced to turn to the right. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So I personally, and I don't know Netanyahu, and I'm not an Israeli, and I don't get to vote, but my sense is that under the right set of circumstances, going back to 2009, I think that Netanyahu might have had a very different perspective if the people on the left had been willing to join forces with him instead of his having to, what I would argue would be sell his soul to those on the right in order to get them to join his coalition.
So one of the things that I see as an Israeli, and that's why this was pretty much a non-issue in the recent elections, is that most Israelis realize we've got no one to talk to. And so while we have had a lot of conversations over the years, left and right within Israel, there's no partner out there. There's nobody who we can come to some kind of arrangement with, be it Netanyahu or be it someone on the left. And so that's why Israelis now have just really much pretty much left that on the side. And that's an interesting conversation that I've had with people in the States, because I was at AIPAC last month, and there's a lot of this, but what about the two-state solution, and what's with Israelis, that you're not even discussing it anymore? There's no discussion to be had when there's nobody to have it with, and that we have to wait out until our neighbors figure out what it is they want from life, if they want to teach kids to kill other people, or if they actually want to have the decent life, which is what Israelis would like them to have. So this is, I think, a disparity that we're having between Americans and Israelis, and how they're seeing what the issues even are, let alone how people are voting. But, you know, just to come back, you said that, I mean, Israel is of paramount importance to you. Israel's survival is so important. So where were you raised? Like, what were your parents like? Does that come from the home? Does that come from life experience, that you have this just unshakable connection with Israel, that you go up against, you know, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, being in a Reform synagogue these days and having these views isn't, I think Reform, I think you're the same, and the Reform movement changed. We'll talk about that in a minute. But where does this come from, this deep love that you have?
I think it comes from me. It did not. My parents, my grandfather on my father's side was an Orthodox Jew who went to shul every day, who founded the shul to which he went. His children became assimilated, for want of a better word. And when I was growing up, I was a high holiday Jew. In fact, my bar mitzvah was the byproduct of a tutor who was hired by my parents to teach me my Torah and Haftorah portions for 3 years. And I never went to Hebrew school. And I can't tell you why it is that for as long as I can remember, Israel was as important to me as anything, and as important to me as a Jew, and I believe to the survival of the Jewish people. I think after World War II, the Jews have to have a place to which they can turn, and they were the only people who didn't. And I think what we're seeing in the United States now, and it's only a little bit behind what started in Europe not too long ago. The rise in antisemitism is frightening. I think that, you know, antisemitism is the oldest hatred, and it's been with us certainly since Augustine in the 3rd century, and we've survived. But after World War II, it was not politically correct to be openly anti-Semitic unless you were on the fringe of some group. And I think that little by little after the Six-Day War, and this I attribute to a very great extent to the left and not to the right in the political spectrum, because in the United States anyway, the people on the far right were openly anti-Semitic from the get-go. The people on the left would be very happy to cry over our graves, but they feel compelled to adopt the quote-unquote downtrodden. And after the Six-Day War, the perception of the Palestinians changed, and they became the downtrodden. And little by little, I believe that view has morphed into anti-Semitism in the form, in this country anyway, of movements like BDS, which I think is a movement with its ultimate intention of destroying the state of Israel. And I think that maybe people are beginning to see that, but it's taken a while. And I think that a lot of what's happening in this country is frightening, because I think that there's a big split among Jews in this country, especially generationally. And I think, unfortunately, among the younger Jews, the feeling for and the tie to Israel is limited. And I know in my congregation, we try very hard to establish lasting ties to Israel, beginning with our kids at the youngest age, and we have regular trips to Israel every year. If a family can't afford it, we will subsidize the trip. We've formed a tie to Kol Hanishima, which is the Reform Synagogue in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So our kids go to Jerusalem. I'm going to say around Hanukkah, and the kids from Kol Hanishima come to us around Passover. And that's been a relationship which has spanned 15 or 20 years. In addition to that, we have usually at least one family trip to Israel, and then some other trips. So we try hard to maintain a relationship to Israel. I think part of the difference is between my view of what takes place in Israel and the view of many of my co-temple members is that I think, I don't know if it was a Golda Meir or Abba Eban who said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And my sense of what is happening in Israel is that up until not too long ago, most of the Israelis were willing partners in a two-state solution. And there was just nobody on the other side with whom they could speak. And I remember my wife, my dear wife, who embarrassed me when I had been invited to a J Street program, not far from where I live. And Jeremy Benamy, who's the head of J Street, is from my congregation. He's married to the daughter of my old cantor, who's a very close friend. And I know Jeremy. And I don't agree with J Street. And I went to this program because my wife embarrassed me and said, you can't only listen to those with whom you agree. And I showed up, and the woman who was running the program handed out these index cards with bullet points. And on the bullet point was, Abbas believes in a two-state solution. Fayyad believes in a two-state solution. And I raised my hand and I said, Netanyahu believes in a two-state solution. And this wasn't too long after his speech at Bar-Ilan University, which I think was, 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. And the response from this woman was, oh, well, how can you believe a word that Netanyahu says? And I said, I don't get it. You're sitting here and we're all Jews, and you're believing the words that Abbas said and the words that Fayyad said, and you're not going to believe the words that Netanyahu said? How can you do that? And I asked this woman if she would be willing to have coffee with me. And she said yes, and that was the last I heard. And that bothers me because as I am friends with my friend Eve Harrell, and I'm willing to speak across the divide, I'll speak to anybody. And the attitude that I'm finding on the left is that they're not willing to speak to somebody like me. And I think that's really very unfortunate.
Well, I know that for years already, you've been trying to get me to speak at Rodef Shalom. Have people hear the perspective of somebody who lives in Judea. They don't have to agree with me, but put a human face on it. Have them ask me questions. I would come and I would be in a debate. And they have consistently refused to let me in.
I don't know if you remember, but you in fact did come to speak. I believe it was in the spring of 2001. You spoke in our Shafla Forum, and then after you spoke, people were lined up 10 deep to ask you questions, and you did get a very good reception, except from our rabbi. But I think he's also changed, and he's moderated. So I think if, as, and when I can ever get you to come to speak there, and it's not your fault, it's our fault, I think, at least from the leadership, you get a different reception. And from the congregation, I think you would be surprised at the reception that you'll get. There are people that people don't necessarily advocate, but people who are strong supporters of Israel. Okay. And it's not Israel right or wrong. but it's strong supporters of Israel and strong belief that Israel has to exist. And I something that I always think about is, you go on an airplane, and some flight attendant tells you what to do in case of an emergency, and one of the first things you have to do is save yourself. And after you save yourself, you can then try to save others. And I think the same of Israel. I think that Israel has defense concerns that we can, in the States, can't really fathom, because we don't put up with that on a daily basis. And Israel has got to defend itself against those threats before it can, give up land for peace. And the whole concept of the land for peace was probably, blown to smithereens with southern Lebanon and Gaza.
Or literally blown to smithereens with things that happened in Israel as well, and a lot of the terrorism. Plus, we see what's going on in our neighborhood with Syria that doesn't exist anymore. And that is definitely how we feel. And it's something that I say to Americans here. You've got two big oceans on either side, Canada and Mexico. You can't possibly understand what it's like being about the size of New Jersey and living with some of the worst people on the planet as your neighbors. We are, to some degree, an island. But what I find is that even people who are pro-Israel are not necessarily pro-Jews being able to live like where I live. And that's a conversation that I think still has to happen, because there are a significant number of Israelis now who have moved over to my point of view and realized that we have rights to be there as well, that us being in control of the area is actually not just good for the Jews, it's good for the Arabs there as well. And there's a lot of shifting that's happening within Israel that I don't think American Jews are well enough aware of.
Well, that's just it. I had mentioned my involvement with this group called Alliance for Middle East Peace. And even in the worst of times, I used to host telephone conferences. And on those conferences, I had Palestinians and Israelis from Israel and people in the States. And even when rockets were going back and forth, and even in the midst of conflicts in Gaza, people were civil with one another. They talked to one another. These groups worked with one another on a day-to-day basis. And we don't read about that here. We don't know about that here. And I've always said that if more people knew about the daily interactions between the Palestinians and the Israelis, we'd have a very different perception of what goes on there. And I'm also bothered by the fact that, we're maybe 5,000-6,000 miles from Israel, and we shouldn't be in a position of passing judgment. Israel is a democracy, for better or worse, and given what I'm seeing in the States nowadays, I'm not sure that we're in any position to pass judgment on better or worse. I'm not sure we're any better than anybody. And if Israelis want to vote in Netanyahu or his party, that's their prerogative. We should pass judgment on it.
Well, and we're sitting here just a few days after this terrible, you can't even call it a political cartoon, in the New York Times, which is really, the paper of record. So what are you thinking about that, or what are the people that in your congregation, or what the rabbi has said about that?
Well, I actually, because of my surgery, I haven't been in the synagogue since. I know that there's been a great deal of outrage, and I'm actually surprised at the extent of the outrage across the board. And I wound up writing a letter to A.G. Sulzberger, who's the publisher of the Times, and if I can find it, I actually got a substantive response from him. So
okay, you wanna? Yeah, absolutely. Let's look for that and hear what he wrote back to you, because this is, I think, really crossed a lot of lines. Nobody could say that the New York Times has been pro-Israel, and they certainly did their best to hide a lot of information that was happening about the Holocaust while it was going on. Of course, Holocaust Remembrance Day was just today, and but this is really another step, and it's a frightening one. Have you found the letter? Okay.
Yeah, well, I have the letter from Sulzberger to me, which was sent by email. I'm not sure. Just to put it, I have my. This is what I wrote to him. on April 29th. Dear Mr. Sulzberger, I am a born and bred New Yorker. I will be 76 on my next birthday. I have been an avid reader of the Times since the mid-1950s. I was a print edition subscriber since the mid-1960s and have been an online subscriber since inception. For many years, I've been troubled by what I perceive to be an anti-Israel bias, especially when it comes to Mr. Netanyahu. I have thought about canceling my subscription, but buried those thoughts. That is, until now. I am not inclined to give the same free pass as Bret Stephens for the egregious publication of the cartoon depicting Messrs. Netanyahu and Trump. I await a response from the Times which goes beyond its wishy-washy apology. And today I received the following from Mr. Sulzberger. Mr. Kranis, thank you for taking the time to write, and thank you for being a loyal reader of the Times. I appreciate hearing your feedback and take it seriously. I agree with you that the cartoon published last Thursday was offensive and clearly anti-Semitic, and we should not have run it. You have seen our editor's note and apology. Our opinion page also published an editorial yesterday, parenthetically, which actually was quite substantive in its apology, that addresses the cartoon and the danger such imagery poses at a moment when anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world. We're making changes to our production processes and have already stopped publishing any syndicated cartoons. You have my commitment that we are working to ensure something like this won't happen again, with the initials AG at the end.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you mentioned, and it's fairly clear that anti-Semitism is on the rise. We just had the shooting in San Diego, where a woman was killed, in the Chabad there. Of course, Pittsburgh 6 months ago, but just so many incidents that most people don't even know about. Swastika spray painted on dorm doors and people getting beaten up. Do you think that anti-Semitism is related to anti-Zionism, that's part of, anti-Semitism morphs, as you said, over the centuries?
I think what's happened is that anti-Zionism has morphed into anti-Semitism. And I see little or no distinction between the two, the way it's preferred today. I think that, and this comes mostly from the left. I think that people on the left have adopted the Palestinians as the downtrodden people and pat themselves on the back for their social action. But they're doing so at the expense of the Jewish people and the existence of the only Jewish state in the world. Now, and what has bothered me for the beginning of this whole process is that Israel is held to a different standard. And I go back to June of 2004, when the Presbyterian Church in the United States adopted what was then called a resolution in favor of divestment. And that December, there was a gathering at Auburn Theological Seminary of 100 people, 50 Jews and 50 Presbyterians. And from that group, to protest what the Presbyterian Church was doing. And from that group came 3 working groups, and I was a member of each. And we formed what became a Jewish Presbyterian dialogue group. And each year we fought, well, it's not each year because the church met every 2 years. We fought these resolutions. The problem with it, as I saw then and as I see now, is that the Presbyterian members of our group, who were very clearly against that resolution and claimed that the resolution was slipped through at midnight, I'm not sure I believe that, but they didn't have the same fire in their bellies as the Jews in our group did, and for obvious reasons. This may have been a singular issue for us, and it wasn't for them. So they wouldn't muster up their strengths until the spring of the year of the convention. whereas the groups in favor of divestment was spending 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, fighting this issue. So when our group got to the floor of the convention, they were always behind the 8 ball. And we were successful up to a point, and that point came a couple of years ago when the resolution finally passed. And that was always problematic, and it's always something that I believe if we Jews are going to fight, we have to fight for ourselves, and we can't rely on somebody who's not Jewish to fight for us.
A little bit about your personal story, which has always fascinated me. You mentioned that you've had a surgery, and you've had a series of surgeries over the years. I'm looking at, I don't know if these are canes or these special crutches that you have. Just so my listeners have an understanding of the single-minded devotion that you will have to something, not someone who anybody's ever going to call a victim. Will you tell them a little bit about, like, physically some of the trials and tribulations that you've had for 50 years already, for quite a long time?
So I had just graduated from college in 1965, and I was about to enter law school, and I had a summer job in a meatpacking plant in Brooklyn. And at some point on a given day, I was instructed by the plant manager to take a hand truck loaded with meat from the 4th floor down to the 3rd, along with another summer employee. And we loaded the freight elevator, and we pressed 3, and 3 came, and 2 came, and 1 came, and then came rock bottom, and we crashed. And the other guy and I were able to climb out of the elevator at that point, and I wound up with what was diagnosed as a back sprain and went back to work. In 1969, that back sprain became a really serious injury, which after a couple of surgeries at St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, I was left paralyzed from the waist down. And I spent a couple of years in a wheelchair. I had iron braces on each leg up to my hip. I had a strong appetite for exercise. I also had a wife and a child. And I could, on the one hand, turn around and cry and feel sorry for myself. On the other hand, I could work my ass off and get out of the predicament in which I was, which I did. And little by little, I started to regain a lot of what I had lost. I never regained it all, but the first thing I did was become an avid and competitive swimmer, because swimming was a non-weight-bearing activity. I then set a goal of biking before my children, and I became an avid and competitive bicyclist. And at some point, and throughout the 1980s, I was competing in ocean mile races and bike races. And I had this cockamamie thought at the beginning of the 1990s that I would really like to do a marathon. So I went to speak to my doctor, because I'm not totally crazy. And much to my amazement, he gave me his blessing. And I wound up doing 6 New York City marathons. I also did 5 sprint triathlons, and loved every minute of it. I won't tell you what my times were.
No, tell us what your times are, because you didn't, cross the finish line in 2.5 hours.
No, so of the 6 marathons, the best was in 1996, and I made 10 hours and 4 minutes. My goal had been 10 hours, and if you take the 4 minutes and divide it over the 26.2 miles, a little bit of foresight, I could have made the 10 hours. And the last one I did was in 2003, and that was 12 hours, 49 minutes, and 7 seconds. But who was counting?
But I remember being in touch with you afterwards, and you told me that by the time you crossed the finish line, they were already putting it away. Okay. I mean, you were with your crutches. Right. And everybody was gone, and all the barricades and everything were gone, and you were not going to give up crossing that finish line.
Well, I started 6 and I finished 6, and I loved every minute of it. And the only reason I stopped doing it was because my left knee was completely shot, and the doctor who was about to do a knee replacement said he wouldn't touch me unless I swore I'd never do another race. So I swore, and I've not done another race. But as Eve can see when she gets up from this room, I've got a series of plaques here from my marathon experiences, and I loved it, and the people on the route were great, and my wife was like a general, getting people to support me along the way, and it was just great experiences.
You know, these days, it's like the thing to be the victim, right? Nobody takes, no, I shouldn't say nobody, but many people don't take responsibility for their actions. I'm like this because this happened to me or that happened to me, and therefore I can get away with everything. And here you are, where you could have had every excuse in the world, definitely not to run a marathon, and you refused to do it. And you're talking about the joy that you experienced that, I have felt on a, I can't even compare level, but the things that have made me afraid. And then when I do them anyway and I get out of my own way, that's a high like you just can't explain to anybody else.
It's a high like drugs. And I've never been a drug addict, but crossing the finish line stayed with me for a minimum of weeks and oftentimes for months. And it was the greatest feeling. And I'm not sure how much I've passed on, but I was telling Eve, I have a grandson out in Los Angeles who's a freshman in high school and has become a wrestler. And he's really worked his tail off. And he did really, really well in his freshman year. And he's learning that you get out what you put in. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, that was my life. And my life was always compartmentalized. I had what I think was a successful legal career as a litigator. I used to wake up at 4:30 in the morning so I could do my workouts and then go to the office. But maybe because of getting hurt and wanting to give back, and maybe because it was my makeup, but I've always been socially active. So I ran a homeless shelter for over 30 years, and I still volunteer monthly at the shelter. I've spent a lot of time fostering relations between the Jewish and the black communities, between the Jewish and the Muslim communities, not always successfully, but at least I've tried. And there's a poem which I keep up on my wall called "The Man in the Glass." It was by an anonymous author, and the gist of it is, if you can wake up in the morning and look in the glass and be reasonably satisfied with what you see, then you've had a reasonably satisfied life.
Are you worried about America? I mean, your life has spanned, you're almost 75, quite a few decades, quite a few ups and downs in this country, and in Israel, and a lot of the things that you care about. Is what's going on here now, and I include in here the antisemitism. I include in here the intolerance of people, anybody who's different. What we call this intersectionality of, if you're pro one victim, you have to be pro every victim. Almost the loss of identity because nobody's any different than anybody else. What are you seeing? I mean, if you're not a prophet, but what do you see for the next few years in this country?
I'm very concerned, and not so much because of the items that you touched on, like intersectionality, because I'm not sure that has a material impact on anything, just as I don't think BDS has a material impact on anything. But what I'm seeing in this country is a complete collapse of governance and of democracy. And I think the idea that the United States is special, at least in my mind, has gone. And I fear not for myself. I've lived my life. I'm not about to die, but I've had the things that I wanted to have, and I'm not going to miss out on very much. My kids, my oldest son is 50. He's reasonably set in his ways, as is my younger son, who's 47, and my daughter, who's 44. I'm really fearful for my grandchildren, and I'm fearful for what they're going to wind up with in the United States of America. And this has nothing to do with the fact that they're Jewish. I see that everything that I valued growing up and the pride that I had in this country just falling apart. I think part of what Eve touched on is that, people who don't agree don't talk. Years ago in Washington, members of Congress lived in town, and they would go back to their districts on the weekends. And by definition, they had to relate to one another, whether it was in the gym or in a restaurant or going out and getting drunk somewhere. And they don't do that anymore. They don't. They don't move their families. And they don't have anything to do with one another. I was never a fan of Ronald Reagan, but, one of my favorite stories was always how Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, two Irishmen, would get together at night and drink scotch. Or Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, who on opposite ends of the Supreme Court spectrum found the love of opera to bring them together. And we just don't have that anymore. We don't. I was telling Eve the story of a man that I met in 1973 when I was 30. He was my friend's father-in-law, John Kelly. And John Kelly was an old Irish Catholic career Navy guy whose politics were to the right of Genghis Khan. And, here I'm a Brooklyn Jew who at that time was probably very much on the radical side of things. And we couldn't agree on anything. And we started to bet on politics. And if he won the bet and I had to send him a check, he'd endorse it over to the Republican National Committee. And my wife and I would get holiday cards from Betty and Jerry. And if I won, I would endorse his check over to the Americans for Democratic Action. But somehow or other, even though we couldn't agree on anything, we never disrespected one another. And as time went on and I was arguing cases in the appellate courts up in New York, John Kelly would fly up from Florida just to listen to my oral argument. And when my wife and I would drive down to Florida every either December or April for the holidays, we would stop off in Orlando and visit the Kellys. And to the day that John Kelly died, he and I were friends, and we had absolutely nothing in common. And it's one of the greatest prides of my life that we were able to do that. And I don't see that happening. I was telling you the story about going out to dinner with some friends, one of whom was a Trump supporter. And we were cautioned beforehand, don't talk politics. And I don't see why not. Talk, disagree, but talk, and then have a drink afterwards.
So you're less worried about enemies from without than you are from the country just falling apart from within, that it's lost its way.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter, I very much so in this country, but I also feel the same way about Israel. I think that the religious divide in Israel presents a greater threat to the survival of the country than does the people on the external borders, whether it be Syria or Lebanon or the Palestinians or the rockets. They're not going to bring Israel down. But what might bring Israel down is the religious divide.
So I'm going to disagree, because from living there, there's much less of a religious divide than the Americans are seeing. We do pretty well. And obviously I don't belong to this group, or there's certain groups that I disagree with their way of life. But there is, maybe because I feel there's a different kind of Judaism being born in Israel now, that because it's, we're back in our own country. So in addition to religious issues, you have some kind of new culture that is now being born or maybe reborn. And a lot of people are part of that, even if they don't, let's say, keep Shabbat the same way or whatever it is. And so I'm actually much more optimistic, I think, than a lot of American Jews are about Israel, which is good since I live there. But I'm going to agree with you about the United States. What do you think? I'm assuming you're still a Democrat. What do you think about the Democratic Party now?
I think the Democrats are going to shoot themselves in the foot with their feet, and I think Trump's going to get reelected. I just, the idea that 21 people think that they have the right timber to be president just blows my mind. And if the Democrats had 1 ounce of intelligence, they would go behind closed doors in a smoke-filled room, like
a conclave, what they do at the Vatican.
But that's what they used to do, and because of people like me in the 1960s, they don't do it, but they made deals then, and I think that there ought to be a power structure, and the power structure ought to try to figure out who among all these clowns might have the best shot.
But what do you think about some of the Congress people, like the Muslim, the Ilhan Omar, and some of the others who maybe are feeding into some of this anti-Semitic atmosphere that we have now?
I'm sure that they are. I'm sure every little bit hurts, like the cartoon hurts. Every time that there is something, you're a step further away from anti-Semitism being verboten. So it is a threat, but what right do I have to fault Ilhan Omar, who is a Muslim woman, from having strong anti-Israeli feelings? I'm Jewish. I have strong pro-Israeli feelings, and the difference is that she's a new voice, and she's being heard. I don't think that she presents a threat. I don't think that Tlaib presents a threat. I don't think Ocasio, whatever her name is, presents a threat. What does present a threat, I think, in the United States is within the Jewish community itself. I think that all too many young Jews don't feel a connection to Israel. Israel is no longer that special place. And because Israel, and this has nothing to do with AIPAC, and it doesn't have anything to do with J Street. And because Israel doesn't hold that special place, people in Congress are going to be less concerned about not supporting Israel. And I read today that there's a resolution which was put forth by some congresswoman from Minnesota, not Omar, questioning the support for Israel because of some of the reports coming out of Bet Salom. But the fact that somebody in Congress is willing to put up a resolution like that, it doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of passing today. 10 years from today, 20 years from today, it's going to be very different unless the Jewish community comes together. And, we're talking about anti-Semitism. The ones who are most impacted, aside from the horrific shootings at Tree of Life and the Chabad place in Poway in California, really the ultra-Orthodox, because they literally wear their Judaism on their arm sleeves. And they're subject to physical attack when they walk the street. I would like for my congregation to align itself with people like that because of what I perceive to be our common Judaism. The problem is that they don't perceive it to be a common Judaism. I'm treif, and I always will be treif. So that even if I want to reach my hand out, I don't think there's going to be somebody on the other end to take it. And the irony is that, and it's always killed me. We have armed guards. We have New York City police officers in uniform with weapons at all our doors every day of the week.
At the synagogue.
At my synagogue. And this has been true to a very great extent since the Gulf War in 1991. And it's always killed me that the children in my synagogue walk into a building past an armed guard. And I saw a cartoon, maybe in the New Yorker or somewhere, just before Thanksgiving, where and Thanksgiving, at least in New York, in our area, is a time of ecumenism, where churches and synagogues and mosques actually get together to do something good. And there was this little girl in the cartoon walking, and Jewish, walking with her mother to a church where there was going to be this ecumenical gathering. And the little girl is saying to her mother, "Mommy, why is it that when we walk into the church, they don't have an armed guard outside?" Mm-hmm. And it just kills me that we have day schools in my synagogue. So we have kids going from preschool up until 8th grade. And they walk in, and we have multiple buildings. We have about 5 or 6 different buildings. They walk into every building past an armed policeman.
Well, it could be that will come the day that the churches are going to have guards in front of it, and maybe that's something I don't know.
My synagogue can afford it.
Right.
Most synagogues can't afford it. In fact, the Chabad rabbi, pointed that out, that they really needed, and he thinks, I don't know whether he's correct, that if they had an armed guard, it wouldn't have happened. Maybe yes, maybe no. But he said, we can't afford. Now, it costs us over $1 million a year to pay for security. $1 million a year.
Now, most synagogues can't even begin to afford that.
No, and you know, and the fact of the matter is that we go in droves. I mean, we've bucked the trend. We now have, when I joined my congregation in the mid-1970s, we had about 900 families and membership units. We now have close to 2,000, well over 1,800 membership units, and it's a vibrant place where we have lots of kids in our schools. We have these programs for kids. I have grandchildren who live in Rome, and they come in every summer, and we have something on Saturday called Sing and Swing and Shabbat, and I take them to it, and it's they bless the challah, they say the prayer over the wine, but they also have people with string instruments, and they sing, and it's a fun introduction to Judaism, and we have when my kids were growing up in my synagogue, the youth group was dormant. Now we have 40 kids in the youth. We have 40 kids in our confirmation class. My kids never went to confirmation, and these kids develop relationships that last the rest of their lives, and some of them marry, and we develop in them strong ties to Israel. But that's my congregation, and that's not, my congregation is not typical, right?
It's not typical. And we'll see what happens with, the next few generations, if that's sustainable, that love of Judaism and that trying to pass it down.
Well, as terrible as it sounds, it may very well be that this rise in antisemitism will bring us together in ways that we wouldn't ourselves come together.
It wouldn't be the first time.
No.
It would not be the first time, but it's not the way to do it. No. But that's how we have in Israel, which is what I said a few minutes ago, that because we have to band together because of who's around us, a lot of the things that to American Jews they would think we would be upset with each other about in Israel kind of get pushed to the side and aren't as important. So,
and part of the problem for me, and I've always said this to my colleagues who are critical of things that go on in Israel, we're thousands of miles away, and who are we to judge? Well, I'm guilty as they are. I'm probably less guilty when it comes to the political system, but probably at least as guilty, and maybe more guilty when it comes to religious affairs. And from my perception, on this side of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Orthodox carry, and it's not just it's the ultra-Orthodox, carry so much weight. I remember the first time I went to Israel in the 1980s, and we went to the Dead Sea, and the day before we arrived, and we were reading, I guess it was Haaretz, on the plane coming in, and there was a story about an ultra-Orthodox Jewish boy who floated out, and the army came to rescue him. And as the army soldiers were risking their lives to go and save this kid, the kid's schoolmates were calling them Nazis.
Okay, there are stories like that, but first of all, you read it in Haaretz, which is not exactly going to report things in any way that's going to make anybody outside of the core Haaretz readership happy. So, I would say, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but they're definitely going to highlight the extremes. And I don't see that as the mainstream. I see a lot of ultra-Orthodox now in the army. It is not unusual to see a soldier with peyot, with the side curls, where it used to be. It's not anymore. And there's much more I see of an integration happening on many, many different levels, whether maybe an Israeliness, even just the speaking of Hebrew, which is a very big deal.
And and from what I've read, the Jewish women from that community are going out into the business world. They're getting educated. And in some respects, it's a hell of a lot better than what we have in the States. We're suffering, a measles outbreak. A lot of it is coming from the ultra-Orthodox communities in Brooklyn and Rockland County. But that's a side issue, although it's an important issue. A more direct issue is that some of the yeshiva are being closed because they're and this is as a result of lawsuits brought by graduates who said they never got an education, which made them functional in a modern society, and that's a problem. And the fact of the matter is that people in that community have a greater birth rate. If they can't fit into the modern society, they're going to have a terrible impact on that society going forward. And thinking of Israel, if they don't serve in the military, if they're not part of the business community, if they can't afford to support surrounding businesses, that's going to kill the country. And the Palestinians aren't going to kill it, and the Syrians aren't going to kill it, and Hezbollah is not going to kill it, and Hamas is not going to kill it, and the Iranians are not going to kill it.
All right. So like I said before, I have a much more optimistic view. I really do. And there, look, any group, be it ultra-Orthodox, be it Reform, if changes have to be made, be it in the Christian world, in the Muslim world, it has to come from within. They have to reach a point where they say, we can't do this anymore. When you try and impose things on somebody, it just gets their back up and they get very defensive. And again, in Israel, I see these changes happening all the time and very encouraging. And obviously there's work to do. And obviously there's leadership issues on a lot of levels. The people who are telling their congregants not to vaccinate their kids, that has nothing to do with Judaism. And that's just a ridiculous thing. And I was shocked that when I got off the plane, was it just yesterday, there was a sign where the suitcases come out, the carousel. There was a very big sign there saying, if you're not feeling well, it may not be a cold, it may be measles. It's like, wow, that's some welcome to America. I'd never seen that before. So that is an issue, but these are not, it's almost like a cultish kind of a thing. And within every society, you are going to have problematic people. I think, unfortunately, and I'm not ultra-Orthodox, but I think there's a lot of bashing that goes on the ultra-Orthodox that's not fair. And again, you see it in Israel, you see it in even communities here in the States, tremendous amount of kindness and volunteerism coming from that community. And really in Israel, any kind of emergency, and you're going to see guys with big black kippahs and tzitzit hanging out who are coming right away, leaving their families, driving on Shabbat, whatever it takes. And so I don't know if it's my ideal, but every group in society has their strengths and has their weaknesses. And the brilliance of good leadership would be that each group finds a niche that not everybody has to do everything. Not everybody can be a paratrooper, or not everybody can be a brain surgeon, but everybody should find their place like we do as parents, right? Each one of our kids are different. So you don't parent them the same way, each one to whatever potential they have. And when you have different, in Hebrew, the word would be a migzarim. You have different groups within a very, very interesting society. I mean, a very heterogeneous society, Israel, to be able to everyone, do what it is that they can do without crossing their own red lines, and that way make society better, everybody making a contribution. And I see Israel going in that direction. Obviously, we would like it to happen faster and sensitivities and upset to not happen, but people are going to be people. But I am very, very optimistic about Israel. I have to say I'm more optimistic about Israel than I am about the United States right now.
Question for you, which has nothing to do with any of this. Sure. But would you consider your Hebrew to be the equivalent of the Hebrew of somebody who was born in Israel?
Absolutely not. I'm always going to be mother tongue English. My Hebrew is on a high level, but it's absolutely, like, I don't think I dream in Hebrew, although who knows.
What about your children?
My children are completely bilingual. Some of them find English, they're more comfortable in English. Let's say if they want to pick up a novel, something for fun. Some of them will do it in English and some of them will do it in Hebrew. Or even I see like on our family WhatsApp. So some of my kids are putting it up in Hebrew and others are doing it in English, but they both understand everything. But, my kids, 3 of them were born in the States, 4 of them were born in Israel. They're not Americans, though. Even though they speak fluent English and have American parents, they are not Americans.
Do they have American passports?
They do. They're all dual citizens. Look, we come to visit a lot, and you don't, it's just much easier to come in and out on an American passport. But there are many places in the world where we go on our Israeli passports. Because it's better to go in on your Israeli than American, or let's say to Russia. You don't need a visa on an Israeli passport. You do on an American passport. And also, and I do this just as they say dafka. Like I'm going to be going to Greece this summer. I could go in on either passport. I'm going in on an Israeli passport because I'm going in as an Israeli.
But you introduced me to some guy. You came up to my office with some guy who was from Efrat, young guy, I forget his name. Right. And one of the things that struck me was that he had gone to Paris with his family. And this it's got to be at least 20 years. No, not 20, 15 years ago. And he told me that he would not wear a kippah.
Right. Well, we have that.
That bothered me.
But you have that now. Nobody's walking around Paris wearing kippah. I mean, nobody. Paris is not what we'd like it to be. Anyhow, I've taken up enough of your time. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. You see, we had this conversation, but really, you're an extraordinary human being. You have added so much to my life in so many ways, even just being able to disagree with somebody who's very smart and really knows his stuff, but also just as an inspiration for what you've done with things that really could have set you back, and you refused. You're a fighter, and maybe that's the Israeli part of me, but I love fighters, and you are definitely right up there.
It's a mutual admiration society.
Okay, Jay Kranis. This is Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Just here for a few days, and then I will be home, of course, for Memorial Day, which in Israel is a very serious day. We know exactly the price that we have paid for the next day, which is Independence Day. And perhaps that's one of the problems that we have here in America now, is that too many people don't know how hard others fought to keep this country, the great country that it is. It's too much of a sense of entitlement, which we don't have in Israel, because the truth is that we're still fighting our war of independence. It never really ended. And that keeps us on our toes. But it's an unbelievable week. It's a crazy 48 hours of very, very deep grief for the price that we've paid, and very deep joy for the country that we have and that we're going to hold on to for a very long time. Tremendously privileged to be an Israeli and to be living there. And I'm glad to be here, and always glad to talk to people about Israel. And then I'm really glad to go home. So again, Jay, thank you so much for giving your time. You guys can write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Of course, you can always check in my website, Eve Harrow, see what I'm up to. And love to hear from you. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
The Land of Israel Network invites you to the Shavuot of a Lifetime, Thursday through Monday, June 6th through 10th, 2019 at the Jerusalem Mount Zion Hotel. Featuring show hosts Ari Abramowitz and Jeremy Gimpel, Yishai and Malka Fleischer, Gil Hoffman, Eve Harrow, and more. Torah, prayers, classes, tours, concerts, and a children's program. For more information, visit thelandofisrael.travel.